Hello, and welcome to Incorruptible Massachusetts podcast. Our mission is to help you transform state politics. We know that together we can make Massachusetts policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. I know that you are used to Anna being the person who does our intro and bring you in. I'm sorry. She's gone this week doing some important work, but we wanted to make sure that you had this important conversation about rent stabilization, rent control, about the needs of our state to make sure that housing is affordable. That is why we are so excited to have Carolyn Chou from Homes for All come talk to us today. But before we do that, we will introduce ourselves. Jonathan, sorry for the bad intro.
I'll let you 10 out of 10 encore standing ovation for the introduction. Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, activist in Boston. I live in the South End. I've been active on various progressive issue and electoral campaigns for a little over a decade now. Jordan, you can introduce yourself.
And I'm Jordan Burke Powers. I use him. I am sorry. Anna makes it look so easy, and it is not easy. There are many outtakes to this intro. She always does it in one take. So we're just excited to have this conversation, and I am sorry that I butchered it, but it's an important conversation, something I'm very passionate about, and I am so honored to have you here, Carolyn. Carolyn, would you like to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and Homes for All?
Yeah, really glad to be here. Hi, everyone. Carolyn, she, her. I live in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, and I'm the executive director of Homes for All Massachusetts. We're a statewide coalition of housing justice and tenant organizing groups. And I like to say we have kind of two main focuses of our work. We are the state policy vehicle for grassroots housing organizations, and we are trying to expand where there is housing and tenant organizing in our state. So we have strong groups in Boston, Lynn, and Springfield, and we are growing our presence in Brockton, in Worcester, in Fall River, New Bedford, and in the Merrimack Valley, because we know that our communities have been and are moving more and more outside of greater Boston, and we need to organize to keep people where their communities are, but also to organize for power in the places that folks are living now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of rent control and what it is we're trying to push?
Yeah. So, maybe to say a little more. So Homes for All Massachusetts is actually not that old as a container, but our groups have a long history and really came together, as I said, because, I think particularly, and for folks who work in Central Mass and Western Mass, this is kind of eye roll, but I think the greater Boston folks were finally realizing that you need to build at the state level in Massachusetts. You can't just build in the city of Boston and win the material changes we need. And we had strong tenant organizing in places like Lynn and Springfield. So folks came together to really say, what would it take to build state level power? And then the pandemic hit. And through that work together, folks are able to pass for a period the strongest eviction moratorium in the country. And I think it demonstrated what's possible when tenant organizing groups across the state come together, right? And so that led into the last period where we've been organizing for local option rent control and foreclosure mediation and other housing justice policies at the State House. And so, rent control or rent stabilization, whatever you want to call it, really in this current era is a policy to just simply regulate how much rents can be increased year over year. I think there's kind of older schemes like we used to have in certain cities and towns in Massachusetts and like New York and San Francisco have, where there's a rent board, Zoran's one on freeze the rent, right? That's connected to that rent board. But also there's a lot of lessons learned from those policies. Like they have strict caps, like after X year, units are not rent controlled. But, we know that things like rolling exemptions on that help make sure that units, we don't just have this two-tier housing stock. So really taking from the lessons of past policies, we are working as part of a national movement. We've seen states like Oregon and Washington pass policies, states like Colorado, New York's expanded just cause, et cetera, move forward. And so we see ourselves as part of this national movement to regulate rents and for our bill at the State House to include just cause for eviction. So right now we're running a 2-track campaign with a bill at the State House that's local option rent control, meaning cities and towns can enact it with just cause for eviction, and a ballot question that's for statewide rent control. Both are with a cap connected to the rate of inflation with a 5% ceiling. And they include exemptions for small landlords, owner-occupied buildings, new construction. There's some differences, but 5 to 10 years. And they both have something we call vacancy control or not resetting between tenants, meaning like if one person moves in and the other person moves out, the rent control scheme continues and you can't, double the rent between those tenancies.
Quickly,
And I think, sorry.
Oh, quickly, can you explain to listeners what just cause eviction is?
Yeah. And so just cause for eviction means landlords have to have a reason to evict tenants. Right now, that is not true. And this would set out a specific set of reasons for landlords to be able to evict tenants. And we do think this is critical alongside rent control because, people are either getting evicted for no cause or they're getting their rent raised significantly. And those two things come together and work to push people out of their homes every day, right? That's what our groups see. And so we do believe we need both. And, if we do, as the ballot moves forward, we will continue to push for just cause for eviction in the State House and, again, other tenant policies because, just to say, I think rent control is the most meaningful policy for the most low-wage workers, immigrant communities, families, etc. But it is not like a silver bullet, right? We know we need multiple solutions to the housing crisis, and Homes for All is working to build toward a different housing future that centers people over profit. And we see this as a key way to be building the power and making material change for people, but not certainly the only thing we need to do.
It reminds me of in terms of like that as in like something it can be both like very important and not solve everything. Is this like some people I've seen will complain about it because it's not a cure-all, but that would be like telling somebody who's like bleeding profusely out of their arm that you're not going to put a Band-Aid on them because the Band-Aid won't solve the entire problem as they then continue to bleed.
Right. And I mean, I think that we've seen this with the shelter crisis, right? And the removal of family shelter. The state's response, Secretary Gustis and the governors, is all about, well, we just need to build more housing. And we do need to build more housing in Massachusetts. And that really has very little to do with a mom who has nowhere to sleep tonight with her kids. And so, we think that we can actually do both things. And it's disingenuous when, like, I've literally heard state officials say, someone was like, oh, this woman got evicted from her unit and what's going on with the shelter system. And they're saying, well, we've permitted all these new units. I mean, one, they're not affordable. And two, even if we believe that the market will somehow correct itself, it will certainly take more time than most of the folks we work with can wait.
So just to put an exact number, it takes roughly 18 months to 2 years to take something from being approved, not even like sketching it out, trying to get to make sure. And we have a very because of exclusionary zoning processes and a lot of zoning laws, it's a really arduous task to even plan. It's expensive to plan to do something. So you have to spend, you're spending some time planning to build, then you have to get all the permitting in place. And once you get the permitting in place, it still takes a time. And that was before the Trump tariffs, which have made it almost impossible for builders to build right now. They're waiting around hoping the tariffs will go away because the cost of goods is so high that you can't even get the financing to do what it would cost to build currently. So when they say things like, oh, we'll just like build our way out of it. Like, yeah, that's great for 5 to 10 years from now. We desperately need to make it much easier to build, but like, that's not going to put people in their houses today, right now, in this moment. And just to put some other generally when you talk to the public, you don't want to lead with too many stats, but I'd say just really quickly for people to listen, because they're all, you're listening here, so you care about these things. In 2024, we had the highest rent in the country. We, as a state, So there are cities that have high rents, but as a state, it's actually unaffordable across the board. Like I lived in Northampton. That was one of the most expensive places, Northampton, Massachusetts. You're talking about rising rates in Worcester, which used to be affordable. So the problem is that like there are places in the country which have cities that have really high rents. Our city, Boston, has high rent, and also all of our other towns and cities have high rents. It's actually really affordable just to live in Massachusetts. And so when people talk about the outflow of people living in Massachusetts, we have bent over backwards, giving literally dead billionaires money with the so-called dream of keeping, I guess, dead billionaires here. But we are doing almost nothing to keep people here. And the outflow of people from Massachusetts are actually young people, low and middle income people who can't afford to live here, right? They're not leaving because taxes are too high. They are leaving because it's too expensive to live in Massachusetts and work a regular job, live a regular lifestyle. And so these are really policies to rein that in, to get some understanding of the problem. And so I think it's just really important that we think about that. And just the other thing I always, even if you wanted to make it so that people weren't renting, you're like, well, because I'll also say like, we're going to make people into their homes. They have to put people in homes. Besides like the sort of silliness of there's not enough space to put everyone into a single family home. The average price of that from just 2017 rose 58%. So like, just like it went from unaffordable to completely unaffordable in 7 years. Like it affects all aspects of it. But if you can find places to bring down and control costs, that affects it. It affects the marketplace in every place. We can't be like, well, this won't fix it, so it's like, let's not do it. It's like, no, we're gonna do everything. We're gonna do everything because it's a crisis. They don't like when there's a wildfire, they're not like, well, I mean, that tree's done, so we're not gonna spray. No, you're gonna spray water everywhere. You're gonna do everything possible to stop the wildfire. We are in a wildfire of a crisis, and we need to do as many things as possible. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the history of what has been going on in Massachusetts and how we got where we are?
Yeah. I mean, just on what you're saying, I think, and right, and that it's that, this is really housing development. They're profit centers, right? So this is not actually, the problem is we're talking about housing people, but like actually the system that's building housing is not talking about housing people. Their scheme is around profit margins. And so, I think it's why things like the real page and algorithmic price fixing have become such hot topics, because this is how we see, right? There are many landlords who, with those price fixing schemes, will sit on a unit vacant because they know they can get more. And this is not just the big players in Boston. This is the big players in downtown Worcester. These are, this is like any kind of bigger apartment building is probably using some version of this. And so it shows that, right, it's not about just filling every unit. It's about making the maximum profit and manipulating the vacancy rates to do so, which to me just exemplifies the fundamental issue that we're talking about a system where we're talking about, getting people into houses or apartments or whatever units of housing, and the system that we're relying on is not talking about that, right? Yeah.
Oh, just super quick, and this transitions what you're be talking about shortly. But I was going to notice that I found the push around rent control very impressive in Massachusetts, and how it brought back into the discussion something that like legislators had treated as a third rail for many years. That I think largely around like 2018, 2019 was when a lot of activists kind of decided to bring that back into the discussion about something, given how bad the housing situation had got in Massachusetts by that point, in terms of like escalating rents, started entering the discussion in a real way, which has been impressive to see. Then have the activism and organizing behind that, and how the discourse has changed so much from before then.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think it's a combination of the work that folks on the ground are doing, and as Jordan was talking about, how bad the crisis is.
Yeah.
Right. And that we're really seeing, I mean, even in my 2 years at this job, I'm constantly struck by how what we expect to see in our bigger cities in Massachusetts, we see in every town. I mean, one of our organizers is working with 100 seniors in Southbridge whose rents are getting doubled with a new landlord. Manufactured housing, which actually has a version of rent control in TOPA in our state, they're getting bought up by venture capital, whether it's in Ludlow in Western Mass or in Taunton, south of the city, et cetera. Like, this is happening everywhere, right? And so, the longer history, and Jordan and John, you should jump in because you also know some of this, is that, rent control was banned in 1994 by a ballot question put up by the by the landlord lobby, and it lost really narrowly, and rent control, or lost or won, whatever, we lost what we had in terms of rent control, and that was not because of the places that had rent control, which was just a few cities in Massachusetts, but was lost by, mostly suburban and rural communities that did not have a lot of renters. And right, we understand that race and class are very linked in how people message things. And, this whole conversation around exclusionary zoning, it's the same thing, right? It's around who is part of your community, who should be able to live in your community. And that is about racism and classism, right? That are exacerbated there. So, I was certainly not around. Probably many people listening and other folks were, for that 1994 campaign. And I think folks ran a really strong campaign, but we lost. And as John said, right, it became the third rail in Massachusetts politics. But I think through the organizing and through the crisis, we've gotten it back on the table where it is a real conversation. It is something that organized labor is willing to talk about. We're proud to have gotten an endorsement for our bill from the AFL-CIO recently. And it's something that more legislators are at least willing to talk to us about, whether or not they're willing to act. And I think that at the State House, we're really saying this is an opportunity for you to allow cities and towns to decide, right? We need all the tools in the toolbox. We need the transfer fee passed. We need tenant opportunity to purchase act passed, and we need rent control, because each city and town has a different mix of what they need. And the fact we're not allowing cities and towns to enact rent control when we know it is a solution that works across the country is ridiculous, right? And then, with the ballot question, we're looking statewide, because if we're going to bring it to the ballot, right, it's for the people. And ultimately, we have a crisis in our state where people don't trust that elected officials, rightfully so, don't trust that they're going to act and act boldly. And so, we feel that it's important to bring it directly to the voters and say, let's make sure this impacts every city and town, because we are seeing this from places like Ayer and Southbridge to, the traditional places you think of, like a Cambridge or a Medford or Boston, right? But either way, we just need to have more tools in the toolbox, and we need to be able to enact rent control in some way, because we know where there is rent control, it does help stabilize housing markets, right? And it does not totally kill development. But the landlord lobby is strong, and real estate, I think, are the largest contributors to most elected officials. And so, we're up against giant opposition forces, but I think we know this is popular, right? What we've seen in New York, we know this speaks to people, and it feels common sense to most people that landlords should not just be able to raise the rent to whatever they want. I mean, that's the first thing we said to the seniors in Southbridge. This is totally wrong, but it's also totally legal, right? I mean, It's totally legal that 100 seniors in Southbridge can get all live on fixed income, can get their rents doubled, in 1 month, right? And I think that is common sense that shouldn't be happening, right?
I think I always remind people, because they're like, oh, what do you mean? It's like, you have control everywhere. The price of milk is like subsidized by the government. It only raises so much. Like, there is control everywhere in our economy, except for, like, you can't, hospitals can't charge you whatever you want because you need healthcare. There's actual controls about that, about saying, like, no, people need to live. So we control that. Well, people also need to live someplace, and there should be some controls of whether it's happening. I'll give you my absolute favorite example of this. Recently, the legislature regulated secondary tickets. So they made it harder for us to give tickets to each other. So our legislature didn't even have opposition to wading into the marketplace for whether or not you can get a ticket to a show. But it finds it abhorrent to say that it can't regulate remotely whether or not you can afford to live here. Like, how bizarre a thinking is that like ticket sales is something that are more regulated than the thing you need the most, which is where to have something over your head. Like, it's just nonsense. We can do this in a way that absolutely, it's no one thinks Beyonce's hurting because ticket sales are regulated, right? Not like I am a landlord. As a landlord, I'm fine. This would do literally nothing because one, I'm not gouging my people. We raised the rent twice in 12 years. Like, it's just not, or 15 years, like something like that. Like, it's just a long time and it was based on our taxes going up because the price of our home went up because it's all inflated, right? Like, it's all nonsense. Like, we would just, if our house wasn't unnaturally inflated, we would just pay less taxes and we could actually charge less rent. So like, there's this, so like, it's just not the case that you somehow need to gouge people to afford to allow people to live. Like, every other marketplace works fine with controls. Doctors do fine. That is a heavily marketed, you can't just become a doctor. You can't walk on the street and say, I'm a doctor. No one thinks lawyers are hurting for money, but lawyers are, they're a little bit, we can talk about that differently, but, young lawyers, but like, whatever, like, that's a regulated marketplace. There are plenty of regulated marketplaces. They're, in fact, everywhere in the country. We regulate our electricity, we regulate our internet. Like, we can do this, and corporations will be just fine, and they will continue to make housing. It's a silly argument that's just on its face makes no sense. Jonathan, you're muted. I should have got my cup out that says that.
I was always like, whenever we're talking about the ballot question that happened back in 1994, that people often seem to forget how close that actually was. That it was something that the ballot question to ban rent control only passed 51 to 49. And like, knowing that was in 1994, so that being now 31 years ago, that a number of the people who voted to ban that are dead, or they've changed their minds, and a lot of other people, right, have we're not the same state that we were in 1994. And so giving, like, I often like to joke that our state is haunted by the ghost of ballot questions past. That if something is that long ago, it's totally valid, but that much time and not much kind of churn in the population. It's also fun just looking at the results that you see some parts of the state have changed quite a bit and some have not changed at all. And those that have changed quite a bit, like seeing about how Somerville voted to ban rent control feels very different than the Somerville of today, which I think would be putting up some of the best numbers for rent control in the state. And in places that haven't changed, shout out to Hampshire County, which was voting like 2-1 against banning rent control back in the mid-90s, and typically shows up for progressive ballot questions with similar margins.
So just to put exact number, 53,863 people. That was the difference. It was less than 2 million people voting. It's just a far different electorate. We should not be held hostage by a difference of 53,000 people, 54,000 people. Like, it's just not like that. That was the difference of whether or not we still had rent control or not. Like, that is not enough people. We should revisit it. I want to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add all of that. And I do really believe, like, in some of these counties where it was close, like in Worcester, is under 10,000 votes. Like, in this, I keep saying it, but it's just true. Like, in the smaller cities and towns in these counties, like, there are 1,000 more people who have been personally impacted, whether it's them or their parents or their child or whatever. So, I just think, we're a different state than we were then. And I just, on this, I think I just like to talk about this, like on what you were saying, Jordan, around the landlords and corporations. I think that's totally right. People see landlords as like their neighbor, right? And of course, many landlords in Massachusetts are like you, like just own one property. But the landlords that are raising the rent year after year tend to be professionals, right? Whether
Yeah.
they're big corporations or they are a guy in your town, but a guy who owns 1,000 units and makes
Yeah.
that's his business. And exactly, any industry should be regulated, and people have to comply, and people will make their pro formas work. People will make the numbers work, right, within the regulations. And so I think there's this way in which people both aspire to be landlords. They don't see it as a profession. They see it as passive income. Like there's this weird perception of who landlords are when we know real estate is an industry, right? We know these large corporate landlords, this is their business. This is their everyday work. They go to an office and they're landlords. And those are the people that really we see the most egregious rent hikes from, not the person who owns a triple decker on your
Yeah, I just want to say, I just want to say that really quickly. Across the street from me, it's double the same, almost the exact same building. Across the street from me is double what we price, and that's because it's a nameless corporation who does not care about this. And in Worcester, I think it's over 60% of our stock is owned by three corporations. So I only own this building because the federal government regulated that a regular person had to live here. We actually couldn't get into the housing market because when we were competing against cash buying corporations who masquerade as regular people, like, oh, he's wearing jeans, he's in my neighborhood, but he's like one of three people who owns all the stock. My neighborhood is owned, mine like blocks, almost 80% is owned by one corporation. There's just a few of us on this block who are like owners of the thing, and we'll never be at a meeting. We're never at the state house. They'll talk about small landlords, but none of us get talked to.
Right.
There's always these corporations, and the small. I'm a part of the Small Property Owners Association, and which always cracks me up. And they had a press conference to oppose these things, and one of the small people was somebody who owns several buildings, and I was just like, "You're not a small property corporation." Like, I'm a small property owner, and I don't like this isn't passive income. Like, we live here. We just try to make it work for everybody who lives here, right? Like, it's just ridiculous the way people make them the same people. They're not.
And it is striking how often, like to your point, whenever there are like speakers to talk about like pity the small landlord, and it's somebody who owns multiple buildings, and that's not anybody's idea of what a small landlord is. And that you do get some small people who actually are legitimately small landlords who think this is somehow going to like impact them greatly. And you're like, how much do you actually raise the rent each year? And it's less than the cap. And then like, this does not affect you.
Well, and I think one problem we have in Massachusetts, and there was a report on speculation a few years ago that kind of highlighted this, is we have a lot of quote unquote mid-size landlords in Massachusetts, which means that they could be a guy you kind of know, or you might actually see them. We have the gray stars and the big national players, but we also have a lot of these mid-sized players who do send their kids to school in Westboro or in Southboro or whatever. But ultimately their business is being a landlord, right? It is not like someone who lives in the house and just rents out their extra unit and is really tied to property tax increases, their mortgage. It's like, these are folks who have a whole business, who go to their office every day to raise people's rent. And so, I think that we have a particular challenge here with the mid-size landlords, where people can put a face to them, but we understand that this is just an unregulated market and we need to regulate it.
Let's talk about the new ballot initiative. And what I think we've talked about it already, but let's talk about the campaign. Let's talk about what's happening and where it's going. And I mean, we're excited about it. So tell us more.
Yeah. So, our tenant organizing groups came together. We've been running a legislative campaign for multiple cycles. And, this year, are proud to say we have over 100 endorsing organizations. We're expanding our co-sponsor list. We feel like we are in the conversation in the State House, and we all know how the State House works, and that there's very few people that control the conversation. And, our people can't wait, right? They can't wait while corporate landlords continue to buy up buildings in their neighborhood. So we said, let's go for it. Let us start collecting signatures, do a grassroots community-led campaign to get on the ballot. So we are rolling now on collecting those signatures. The ballot question is called Keep Massachusetts Home, and our website is keepmasshome.com. So you can sign up and collect signatures. And we are in every county. We're making plans, in all the gateway cities. And we're really excited to activate groups and activists across the state. I believe this is how we build the kind of power we need to across the state to really show what people want and need and how many people are willing to put their time into making that happen. I think we need to be bold and visionary, and we need to be speaking to people and their needs. And I hope that through the signature gathering, we can really build that kind of grassroots power together and, and start to shift, right, the balance of power and who is activated in our cities and towns and across the state.
And just talk a little bit about what, so we've talked around it a little, but talk specifically what the ballot will do. Like, what will it do? Like, what is it trying to do?
Yep. So it is, our ballot question would cap rents across the state to the cost of living with a cap of 5%. It would exempt new construction for the first 10 years. It would exempt owner-occupied buildings under 4 units, and it would exempt some other, technical buildings you have to exempt, like dorms and some versions of like nonprofit housing. But it would cover a wide swath of just the everyday housing in our cities and towns, and it would make sure that the rent cannot go up more than that annual increase, even when a tenant moves out and a new tenant moves in. And so this is really bold policy. It would certainly be the strongest in the country, but we feel like the crisis is also really huge here, right? We know the rent is already too high for almost everyone in Massachusetts. And so while we cannot lower the rent, we can make sure that people do not continue to get pushed out more and more with a bold policy like this. And we're excited to be talking about a statewide policy because we feel like this does impact renters, even in towns without a lot of rental units, and certainly in our big cities. And this will really speak to, an immigrant family that moved to Northborough, as well as, a family who's been in Springfield for 3 generations, or a, recent college grad living in Medford. So I think we're really wanting to speak to all the working class and middle class folks here in the state. This is a cross-class, cross-racial movement. And yeah, those are some of the components.
And so just to clarify for folks, it's not that, because a lot of times they'll say like, well, you can't raise rent. And while like we could argue about how much you actually need to raise rent, it does not do that. It doesn't say, nope, you can never raise rent, because that's often what people think of. They're like, oh, they have these like make-believe stories that the media made about like people in New York living in buildings since the 70s, and it's still like a $500, which of course don't exist. And this is a total lie that the media continues to talk about. But whatever, that's what people in their minds, that's what they have in their minds. They're like, oh, I'll never be able to raise rent. And all this is saying is like, if inflation goes up, if it costs more for things, you can raise it a little to keep up with that. That's it. But it just can't be out of control. It's got to have some control, like every other industry. I just always like to like frame it for folks, because I think again, people just have this mythos about what it is we're talking about. It's like very it's very reasonable and not things. And just as an academic aside, because a lot of the times you'll hear things like, oh, like it hurts the ability to build and all these other things. I'm getting my PhD and I'm working on housing as a focus. And I can tell you that there is a ton of studies that say that this is just not true across the world. because we often think about it, they're like, we just think about America, but actually there's lots of places that have some sort of rental controls mixed in with other housing policies. And together, this is going to be shocking. People still build homes. They still build apartment buildings in those places. They're not totally stopped from building. It's still happening. It's just untrue that the marketplace collapses. It's just untrue anywhere in the world where these things happen. All it does is it just allows people to be able to live in their place more year per year and be able to plan for it, to be able to understand like, oh yes, it might go up a little, but I can plan for that. I can ask for a raise. I might get a raise of 3%. This is going to cover it, right? It's as opposed to like it gets doubled and you had no idea, which is currently what can happen.
Right. And that's, I feel like even when we have the home ownership conversations, like a lot of what I think most of us are looking for is stability, right? Whether we're renting or owning, we're looking for stability in our housing. And so a mortgage is, a fixed rate. It in some ways is really not stable if we learned anything from 2008, but there's a way in which to people it feels stable. And I think renters often feel like they don't have any of that stability. And that's not because they don't own, it's because their landlord has so much control to just do whatever they want and raise the rent however they want, right?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the legislature and what's before them. We were laughing beforehand that just a little bit of like, it's a different ask. We're asking for regular people to have a say about like how much putting some like just general control on a marketplace like we do everything else. But in the legislature, what we're asking for is just democracy, just like allowing democracy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're continuing to push forward a 2-track strategy with the statewide ballot question, signature collection rolling, and also we will still have a hearing on our local option rent control bill in the housing committee coming up in the next few weeks. And so we know that the legislature could do something now to make it easier for cities and towns to make it possible for cities and towns to enact rent control and easier for our organizing. And we are still pushing them to do that because, I think going to the ballot helps build people power. And I think it is not the way we want to all be legislating, right? We would like to have a legislature that is moving forward on the policies that bring material benefit and stability to our communities. And so we are going to continue to push the legislature to pass local option rent control that we can then work at the municipal level. And we are, continuing to build in lots of cities and towns to push the legislature. Besides the home rule petitions that we have seen in places like Boston and Somerville, we also know the East Hampton City Council passed a resolution saying they're ready if this were to pass, and we'll see more of those come forward. So, I think the main reason there's a difference is one, if we're going to bring things to the voters, we want it to impact their lives right away. Versus, if we move through the legislature, then we have more time to do that municipal organizing. And also that, we all know our state house, they have very particular ways they like to move things, and local option and pilot programs tend to be really favorable to our legislature, but we don't think they speak to people as we're on the doors. So, that's kind of part of the difference is really just if we're going to go all in on a huge ballot campaign and tell people like sign up to do this, like we want to be able to say, and it's going to happen, right? But we feel that if the legislature would prefer something that's more around, as you said, Jordan, like allowing cities and towns to do this, then great, let's pass that. And then let's work in the key cities and towns to start to move that. And we believe more and more cities and towns will because of the state of the crisis. So yeah, we're in this 2-track strategy with these slightly different approaches, but we feel like in the end, either way, we just want to be able to stabilize communities and limit corporate greed in our neighborhoods. And we think either way we can do that. And we would like the legislature to show that it's willing to act toward the things that matter to their constituents.
Yeah. And I'll just say,
that they should,
exactly. A shocking idea. And not one we feel so optimistic about, but certainly we don't feel that we can just abandon that, right? Because we still believe in the potential here, I think. though, every week we may believe in it a little less, given the dynamic.
I just say all the time, like I get really frustrated when our legislature likes to talk about like picking on the importance of democracy and small d democracy, and like this is fundamentally undemocratic. That Florida would love to have, like DeSantis would love to have the legislative control that our legislature puts on our towns and cities. It's absolutely abhorrent that our local towns do not have basic democracy. It's abhorrent. It's an absolutely atrocious authoritarianism that a town can say, this is what's best, us elected officials, to how to handle the situation here, and our legislature does not allow that. It can fix that tomorrow. It's sort of like we said, like, oh, like it's something they like to do, but like it should be in fact easy. It should in fact be easy for the legislature to say, if you elected officials in this town think that this is the best policy, yes, you can do it. It should not be controversial, and it's fundamentally undemocratic that they stand in its way.
Yeah. And, it's so much of why Home for All Massachusetts was founded, right? Because our groups, there's just so little you can do around housing policy at the municipal level. And people are ready, and people want to, do more. People have so many ideas about how to stabilize their neighborhoods, but so little of it can happen in a material way without, without state authorization. So, that's really fundamentally why we came together, was to make sure that our cities and towns were able to pass the types of housing policies that people were pushing for on the ground.
So what are some of the other policies that you're pushing in the State House to sort of round out the conversation?
Yeah. So, as I said, right, we see rent control as a critical fight for us to build people power, shift the balance of power, and move toward a different housing system. But our long-term vision is a different housing system that centers people over profit. So we don't have specific legislation on this right now, but we are really looking towards social housing models and other models of housing, and are excited to be exploring potential policy and just vision in the next few years. But in this legislative session, we say rent control and foreclosure prevention are our top two policies. We have a foreclosure mediation bill as well, because we know this is about tenants and low-income homeowners working together and building power together against corporate interests. And then we've also been working on algorithmic price fixing, as I talked about earlier, and the impacts of programs like RealPage on our rental market, making it easier to access Raft and Homebase and just basic stability through like getting rental assistance and all of that. And then we've been working alongside Mass Coalition for the Homeless to continue to push to preserve the family shelter system that is being gutted by our governor and is devastating to families, as well as to, prevent further criminalization of individual homelessness that we continue to see locally and nationally. And to talk about, we kind of talk about in four buckets. We need to, have more tenant protections. We need to preserve existing housing that's affordable for folks. We need to build more affordable housing, and we need to, house unhoused communities. So most of what we do is in those four buckets. And the other two things I'll highlight are just Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, to allow tenants to designate someone to purchase their building when it's bought by a corporate landlord or anyone, but that's typically what we see. And for them to put in a fair offer, and then, the transfer fee to raise more money for affordable housing.
I put in also that there's a tenant opportunity to buy for both renters and regular folks, and also for small business owners, which is there's two different bills. And then one of the things we find is that small business owners actually, a bunch of, often in Massachusetts, lose their businesses because a corporation buys their building, doubles their rent, most small businesses do not own their properties. They are renting their properties. And so you'll see a lot of small businesses lose their small business actually from that sort of raising of rents from a corporate overlord that they don't see. So another big bill around that. Yeah. All right. Any final words? I've talked a lot. Any final words before we go to Jonathan?
No, really, really excited to build this campaign alongside all of you, obviously folks leading this podcast and everyone listening. So please sign up, do a shift, get involved. You know, this is the fight to get on the ballot for rent control. But to me, it's really symbolic of what it's going to take for us to have a broader fight for housing justice. And so we need to show that this is something that matters in every city and town, in all of our neighborhoods, and we need everyone involved. So yeah, keepmasshome.com is where you can find more info, and we're really excited to continue to build power with everyone.
Awesome. I'll just make a quick closing pitch, and Jordan, you'll probably find the transition that I chose for this amusing. So as one thing we were talking about earlier, it's shortly after when we're recording, and probably shortly before when you're listening, is September 1st, which is the major move-in day in Massachusetts. And one thing that fortunately happened earlier this year is the banning of broker's fees. So you, listener at home, because you don't have to pay a broker's fee this year, you can donate some of that money to the podcast or to Homes for All, right? At the end of the day, like we have a great team of people who are working with video editing, this helping to make sure that all the great work, the production work that goes into a podcast like this, where we are able to have deep, meaningful, engaged conversations with people that you typically don't find in other spaces in the media in Massachusetts. So if you are able to make a contribution, there's no contribution too small, there's no contribution too large. And yeah, shout out to all of our listeners. And Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us today. This is great.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.